The following podcast is taken from a live broadcast on Inspire FM.
Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh, and welcome to Friday Night Live with me, Hafiz Sha'ban, this Friday evening on the 10th of January 2020. Corresponding to the 15th of Jamad al-Awwal, I believe, 1441. And as usual, we are broadcasting live on Luton on 105.1 FM, and nationally also across some of our sister stations, Sheffield Link FM, Peterborough, Salam, Derby, Nottingham, and internationally and nationally you can tune in to Inspire FM and Friday Night Live on the Inspire FM app, and of course via the Facebook live stream. Tune in, and most importantly, join today's discussion, join today's debate. Want to hear your thoughts, want to hear your opinions. 01582 481 822. 01582 481 822 is the number here in the studio. Or 07779 481 822. 07779 481 822 is the number for your SMS or your WhatsApp messages. Right, first FNL, first Friday Night Live for me of 2020, so mashallah, alhamdulillah, welcome to 2020. We did of course have a show last week, and Brother Zafar was here in the hot seat, but alhamdulillah, today in the studio I've got a couple of guests that are going to be joining me in the first hour. I have Brother Abu Isra, mashallah. I'm going to just introduce Brother Isra to our listeners. Normally he joins me over the phone, but alhamdulillah, today we're quite lucky as a radio station to have Brother Abu Isra here in the studio. So let me go straight to Abu Isra, who is of course, in terms of an introduction, is a political analyst and a commentator, and also a very senior executive within the telecoms industry. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah, Abu Isra.
Wa alaikum assalam wa rahmatullah.
MashaAllah, jazakallah for joining us. How are you?
Alhamdulillah, not bad. Jazakallah for having me.
Nice trip in.
Alhamdulillah, it was good. Yeah, it was pretty good.
What hit by traffic?
No traffic at all today.
Alhamdulillah, man. That's good. Nice and early. Nice to see our guests nice and early in the studio. So Abu Isra is going to be joining us in the studio from 6 to 7 and from 7 to 8. We've also got another very special guest that's going to be in the studio, and that is Brother Roshan Muhammad Saleh. Roshan Muhammad Saleh, who is the editor of Islam. What is it called? Islam? Five Pillars. That's it. 5 Pillars, man. Thanks for reminding me. Alright, so that's going to be from 7 to 8, inshallah. Right, what's our lineup today? So we've got a number of topics that we're going to be discussing this evening, inshallah ta'ala, and I'm hoping that you, our listeners, are going to find these interesting and very intriguing. I personally, I think some of these topics are very, very interesting. First one, we're going to be leading with the story on the Belt Road Initiative, right? So for some of you, this may be a new concept and you might not have heard of this before, but you know, if I talk about Gwadar in Pakistan, if I talk about China-Pakistan economic corridor, those kind of terms might be a lot more familiar to you, right? So we're talking about the China-Pakistan relation, the economic relationship that's been developing over the last number of years, and it's huge infrastructure projects that are going on between Pakistan and China. And the question I want to ask, right, I wanted to look into this for a while. The question I'm asking is, what is it? Okay, who are the real benefactors, right? Who's going to really benefit from this, right? Because we know Pakistan as a state, as a nation, where it is, versus the capitalists, versus the people who are putting the money into it, and versus the government of China and Pakistan. So I'm going to be asking, who are the benefactors and who are the real losers, and what is the real net gain that Pakistan's going to see as a result of this China-Pakistan economic corridor and this huge investment that is being made, right? That's the lead story. We're going to go into that in a couple of minutes, and then of course we're going to then be leading on to the next leading story of the last couple of days, and that's been the Iran and the US tensions, right? Tensions, attacks. We need some analysis, we need some update, we need to find out what's happening between Iran and US. I mean, my son came home the other day and he was talking about hashtag World War III. So I mean, there's a lot of people talking about it, right? So let's get some analysis and find out what's been happening, and you know, is it gonna really be World War III? Because it has died down a bit, hasn't it, over the last couple of days? And then we've got a number of other stories that we're going to be covering, but that's from 7 till 8. Let's come on to those later. For now, that's the lineup for the first hour. Right, so let's move on to, inshallah ta'ala, our lead story, and that's of course the China-Pakistan, right? China-Pakistan economic corridor. I looked it up earlier, and it's apparently called Pakistan-Chin Iqtisadi Rahidari.
Oh, well done, mashallah.
There you go, my Urdu man. We're going to hopefully also be speaking to Yasser Masood, who's a senior international relations analyst, right? And he's with a special focus on CPEC and, of course, the BRI, which is the Belt Road Initiative, right? And get his opinion on, and his expertise views on this, right? Now, if you're from the Pakistani background, Pakistani origin, and you've been visiting Pakistan recently, you might have heard a lot about this. I'd be interested to get your views on this, right? 01582481822, whether you think it's going to benefit Pakistan, whether you think it's currently benefiting Pakistan, or whether it's going to add a huge amount of further economic debt onto Pakistan's books already. Abu Isra, let's open up with you. What's your reading into the BRI and particularly the CPEC?
Yeah, thank you very much, Hafiz Sha'ban. My view is that China is an emerging economic power. We've seen that China has gone from a nothing country in terms of economic prowess back in the 80s to a second largest economy in the world now. They've surpassed the European powers like France, Germany, Britain, and they're almost now eyeing themselves or aiming at US to take them over economically, perhaps in the next probably couple of decades. So it's an amazing rise of China's economic prowess. Although there are some who also see this as China geostrategically probably maneuvering and probably eyeing an expansion. I mean, we know the history, for example, of European expansion, certain colonial powers like Britain and France expanding in the last century or the century before that. After Second World War, as we know, US took over the role from Britain and France. But this century, it's a lot of people are talking about is the century of China. But the reality is that if you look a little bit deeper down under the surface, China has traditionally never been an expansionist power. They're a sizable nation, sizable country, and a huge population, obviously the largest in the world. But they've never been expansionist in terms of territorial expansion or any strategic expansion going out of their borders. In fact, the Great Wall of China is a symbol of them containing themselves inside rather than going out. With regards to BRI, the Belt Road Initiative, this actually gives some people an understanding that perhaps China is expanding. China may be expanding, but they are looking at economically. China has been used as a world's workshop, some people called it, a cheap place to go manufacture your goods. China not coming up with any original, ideas of themselves. So all the leading edge high tech work is still being carried out mainly in the US and places like Britain and Germany.
But the workshop is in China, right?
The workshop is in China.
I get that. We've got Yasser Masood Saab also on the line from Pakistan. So let me introduce Yasser Masood Saab to our listeners. And Yasser Masood, earlier I was saying, is the senior international relations analyst with special focus on CPEC and BRI. Assalamu alaikum and welcome to Friday Night Live, Yasser Masood Saab.
Walaikum salam.
Thank you very much for joining us. I know you're joining us at a very late hour from China. Thank you very much. Yasser Saab, okay, we're discussing, of course, the CPEC. And I've asked the question earlier. You probably were listening to Abu Isra, who's here with me in the studios, and giving us an overview of what the BRI initiative is and what in particular the CPEC is. It's a massive program, a massive project, right? Brother Abu Isra has given us an introduction. I mean, the question to you is, I get China's objective. I get China and its interest from this. What about Pakistan from a Pakistani perspective? CPEC, is it making economic sense for Pakistan?
Yes, first of all, it definitely does, because let me give you an example that it's an economic premise all over the world, especially for the developing states. It's a recipe of success that any developing state definitely needs a huge injection of FDI. And unfortunately, Pakistan had a lot of missed opportunities in the past. So why, in the first place, we have attributed so many slogans to CPEC, like, for example, it is being called as the Game Changer Project. It is being called as the linchpin of Belt and Road Initiative. It is being called the heart of Belt and Road Initiative. And these slogans are being attributed from both sides. So definitely it's not without a reason. First thing is that because of CPEC, it is for the first time in the history of Pakistan that if we even look back, if we turn the clock back to the Cold War era and afterwards, like after 9/11, since Pakistan inception, Pakistan has always been remained or cornered to stay under the compulsion of geostrategic or geopolitical realities. It is for the first time that Pakistan has taken a U-turn and embraced the geo-economic realities, and that only happened because of CPEC. If we see all the Southeast Asian states or other developing states, they got progress and prosperity because one, they didn't have any security issues, and second, they accepted the realities of geoeconomics, and that's what happened to Pakistan. That is why CPEC is being called the pilot project.
I get that, Yasir Saab. Okay, so it was launched, back in 2013. We're in 2020 now. Project costs, I'm seeing figures now. Initially, they started in the 30s and 40 billions, and now we're talking about 62 plus billion USD, right? So I mean, the point is, I get the strategic vision that you're selling me, right? But when I visit Pakistan, I don't see the fruits and the results of that on the streets of Pakistan, right? I mean, are the people benefiting from that? I mean, that's my question to you. I get the governments and I get the corporates.
No, that's a very pertinent question, and that question has been raised, number of times. Even in the think tank I'm working, this is the only, government think tank for CPEC. And it's like every day we receive these kind of questions from masses. And yes, for a colossal economic activity or a project like CPEC, the very first question would be that what's in it for the people?
Yes.
And that is actually the whole, the purpose of CPEC.
Yes.
Let me tell you that for the people, or for any economic activity like CPEC, it will definitely take its time, because even if we see from 2013 to 2019, it was the early harvest phase.
Yes.
And in early harvest phase, it only focused on the energy sector and on the infrastructure.
Yes.
Now, we are already in the second phase of CPEC. We are going from semi-industrialization towards an industrialized economy.
Okay.
We are focusing on the technology transfer. So I think it will take its time.
Fine.
And as far as the fruits are concerned, let me tell you the official figures.
Yes.
Because of CPEC, more than 70,000 jobs have already been created, and out of that, 60,000 jobs have been acquired by Pakistani people. Both blue and white collar jobs have gone to Pakistan.
You said 70,000, right? I mean, I've got a report here which said that the projection initially was 2.3 million jobs between I guess that's 215 to 230. But just let's hang on there, Yasir Saab. I want to bring in Abu Isra. I mean, I hear what Yasir Saab is telling me, right? I tell you what my concern is this another promise of a trickle-down economy, right? Which is that eventually it will trickle down, but what normally happens with trickle-down economies, it can take a very, very long time, and there's only very, very few people that actually benefit from something like this. I mean, for example, you go Pakistan, I mean, it's great to drive on the motorway, but we've got fundamental problems in infrastructure of Pakistan, fundamental problems in terms of the people, education, healthcare, employment, but we're building a beautiful motorway, and go to Islamabad, Pindi now, and you see a lovely metro service. But is that the real priority?
Well, you hit the thing on the nail, by the way. Hit the nail on his head. The issue here is that not China investing in a project which ultimately is for its own, primarily for its own benefit. I mean, it's a long corridor which will give them access to Gwadar, a deep seaport. It could turn out to be one of the largest in the world eventually, but it is primarily for the benefit of China.
Yes.
There is an ancillary benefits that Pakistani economy will get, but they are, to be honest, quite minute. In fact, the danger is that once China has completed this corridor and the traffic starts flowing to and fro between Gwadar and Chinese ports, the economic zones that they're talking about building alongside, these zones will be flooded by Chinese companies. And unfortunately, with that will come the Chinese goods flooding our markets. So the danger is that if we are not careful, we will end up having China almost completely dominating and eventually almost there is a danger that they could decimate our whatever local economy we have left with. So there is a significant danger of that. The reality is that for any economy like Pakistan or any other country's economy to grow, it needs to be, it has to be local. It has to be indigenous. It has to be based on a certain structure, so a certain ideological basis. But China has taken a turnaround. They were probably before 80s. They were solid communists. Yeah. They've taken this turn because they've adopted an ideology. And for a country like Pakistan to develop, it cannot just rest and look outside towards other nations and look for FDI, for example. No country has organically grown by just looking at FDI. So there is a fundamental root issue here that Pakistan keeps looking at other nations to come in, other companies to come in and invest. When the policy should be that we need to structurally address this from ideological perspective, give Pakistan a sense of direction. It's a country created in the name of Islam, and Islam as an ideology can propel Pakistan to different heights.
I think that's the key point. Let me just summarize for our listeners, and then hopefully we'll come back to this conversation inshallah ta'ala shortly. Listeners, we are talking about a very key economic program in Pakistan, and this is of course the China's Belt Road Initiative, and of course is also known as the China-Pakistan Economic Corridor, right? You've heard of these projects in Gwadar that are going on, these huge seaports. You've probably heard of this 1,000+ kilometer long motorway which is being built between cities of Karachi, Lahore. It was part of this CPEC program. You've probably seen the video. It's a very impressive video. I've actually seen it myself. The Karakoram Highway from Hassan Abdul to the Chinese border will be reconstructed and overhauled. A lot of things happening. And then also we're talking about the energy requirements and the energy development within Pakistan's infrastructure projects, etc., etc. So a lot in the pipeline, right? But the question is, who's really going to benefit from that, right? And is this the number one priority for Pakistan, or does it actually require more of an ideological direction and setting of priorities and getting a lot of the other functions of the state operational and heading in the right direction, as opposed to just working on this huge multi-billion pound initiative? I mean, some of the statistics are absolutely crazy. I mean, when you listen to it, it's 60-70 billion plus that is going to cost, right, to build all of this this infrastructure. And there have been problems already. Recently Imran Khan was in China to say, okay, that this program needs to resume again. Apparently there was a bit of a pause. We'll ask Yasser Saab what happened, and then also I want to ask Yasser Saab the question, who's going to be paying for this, Yasser Saab? Because of course I know China's giving all of these massive loans to Pakistan, but surely it's going to be wanting its money back sooner or later. 01582 481822 listeners, 0779 481822. If you've got an opinion on this particular subject matter, get in touch please. Yasser Saab, straight to you.
Yes, actually, before us answering your question, I also have a question that actually when we talk about CPAC and we try to find many faults, and yes, obviously there could be many faults in such a big project like CPAC, but the matter of fact is that there was no country under the sun which was investing in Pakistan. Right. And even a country like UK, developed countries or underdeveloping countries, they always attract foreign investment, be it from the government or be it from the private parties or business community. And that's what Pakistan is aiming at. Even the Prime Minister is working hard to attract a lot of foreign investment and to attract the business community, be it from China or other countries. Who's going to pay? Let's come back to your question. Yes. Definitely Pakistan is going to pay. But let me correct the figure straight, because what happens many of the times, many people even in Pakistan, they're not completely aware about the financial modalities of CPAC. Yes. Let me give you the latest figure that up till now around 18.9 billion has been spent on about 22 projects of CPAC. Okay. And out of that, only 5.9 billion with a 2% interest is the loan part. Mm-hmm. So, and the repayment will start from 2021. And all this, that part is stretched between 25 to 30 years. So considering that amount and the eventual upshots which Pakistan will be getting out of CPEC, this is just like a peanut nut. But as a matter of fact, we do understand that there is a hybrid warfare against the Belt and Road Initiative. There is a media warfare in which, even the positive projects like CPEC and other projects are being criticized, and cynics, all over the world, they call it a debt trap diplomacy and things like that.
Yes.
But in case of CPEC, it's a completely different story.
Right. But Yasir Saab, the question that I have for you, right? I hear your point. I mean, it sounds brilliant. On theory, it sounds very, very good too. But my question is, genuinely from, the grassroots. So grassroots is that every, different premier comes and he wants to make sure that he's remembered for a metro or remembered for a road or remembered for this project or that project. It seems that that's going to be my, memory, that's what I've done as a government. But overall, as a nation, are we also moving forward or not? And I think that was the question, right? That are we also moving forward as a nation? And then also, another point that I want you to possibly, comment on is obviously the overseeing of this program too. I mean, is it being overseen by the military? Is it being overseen? Because they're in pretty much every position in government at the moment, right? And where's the transparency and accountability for this program with this huge amount of money that's coming in from China being spent? Where's the transparency, accountability of all of that? How are we ensuring that?
Well, this is something that we are responsible for. It. Chinese are not responsible
Correct.
for our transparency.
Yes.
They have done their bit, and their bit was to invest in Pakistan, which they did.
Yes.
Now, as far as the legitimate questions are concerned, like this one, for example, like transparency, and what would be the modalities, how Pakistan are going to pay. But as I mentioned, that China has offered quite lenient, terms and conditions for the repayment.
Okay.
Another.
Very quickly, Yasir Saab, we only have about 3 minutes left.
Here.
Yes.
Okay. Yeah, just a quick comment is, for example, like we only talk about the debt part.
Yes.
We don't talk about the benefits which will come from CPEC. For example, like Pakistan's transportation network, currently it's in a bad shape, which is causing an annual loss of about 3 to 5% of GDP because of consumption of gas and lubricants and frequent change of spare parts. According to IMF, Pakistan's GDP was about 304.95 billion in 2017, which means it loses about 10.6 billion because of its poor transportation network.
Right.
CPEC will help reduce this loss because it is expected to help improve Pakistan's transportation network.
Fair enough.
And by building the Gwadar port and road network, the CPEC will help Pakistan earn 6 billion to 8 billion a year from road and bridge tolls.
Okay, yes,
actually, we are not talking about the benefits.
Fine. I just want to get a last comment from Abu Isra, who's in the studio, before we have to bring this subject matter to a close. I mean, Yasir Saab mentions two good points. Firstly is the case of, we're not talking about a lot of the benefits that this is going to bring, and then also no one was prepared as a foreign country to invest and develop in Pakistan, right? And this was this opportunity, so pretty much Pakistan had to take that.
Well, I mean, I just wanted to quickly correct some figures here. I mean, Pakistan will be paying $40 billion back to China for 26.5 billion that they are getting or borrowing, or some kind of locked-in investments.
So for 26, they're paying back 40
billion, yes. So that's one thing. The second thing, as I've previously mentioned, if we want to get Pakistan back to where it should be in the global community of nations as an Islamic country or Islamic state or Islamic nation, it will have to do something with its own correct its structural issues with its own economy. This thing that a country will come from outside and do some foreign direct or indirect type of investments, and this will somehow help Pakistan. We need to understand that there are countries out there, the nation states out there, they're out there for their own benefits, and they will do any project for their own benefit, for the sake of their own interest, not for the interest of Pakistan. For Pakistan to take its position in the global nations or the global countries, it needs to to look back towards Islam, fundamentally restructure the economy based on Islamic model, and inshallah that will bring the real prosperity the people of Pakistan are looking for, not relying on powers like US to come in or Britain to come in or China to come in.
Right.
I mean, that is not the way forward, inshallah.
Okay, gents, thank you very much. Yasser Masood Saab joining us from China at a very late hour. Thank you very much for your expertise and your opinions this evening. Thank you very much. Unfortunately, gents,
my pleasure,
thank you very much. Unfortunately, we've run out of time for that first story. It was very, very interesting. Listeners, we were discussing the CPEC, the China-Pakistan Economic Corridor. If you still have questions about it, feel free to reach out. And we've still got Abu Isra for another half an hour in the studio, and I'm sure you'll be able to answer those questions. We've also had Brother Zafar walk into the studio. MashaAllah. Assalamu alaikum, Brother Zafar. How are you?
Walaikum salam. Alhamdulillah.
Good to see you, inshallah ta'ala. We're going to need you for the next half an hour, akhi. And we're going to be going into a commercial break. When we come back, it's all about Iran and US, right? So I'm hoping that we've got enough tension in the studio to discuss this topic too, because there's a lot of tension out there. We're going to be back in a couple of minutes. Until then, assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah.
Assalamu alaikum, this is Atif Nawaz. Listen to Inspire FM shows in your time by heading over to inspirefm.org or listen on Apple Podcasts or Spotify.
Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Welcome back to Friday Night Live with me, Hafiz Sha'ban, and Brother Zafar here in the studio. We've also still got in the studio with us for the next half an hour Brother Abu Isra, who's joined us from Birmingham. Great to have Abu Isra here in the studio too, mashallah. Alright, so we're going to move on from the Pakistan-China conversation and the CPEC conversation onto the next discussion, right? Another leading story, and there's obviously been a lot of tension up in the air outside between Iran and US. So we're going to be discussing what's been happening between Iran and the US, the attacks, the counter-attacks. What's the analysis? What's the update? Who's calling who's bluff, right? And who's shadowboxing and just calling out these bluffs in essence. And what's underpinning it all, right? I want to get to what's underpinning it all. What's the real political drivers behind all of this all of this tension? So we're going to have a number of guests that are going to be joining us, experts on this particular subject matter. If you've got a question, let me know, because as I said earlier, my son came home a couple of days ago and he said, what's all this hashtag World War III about? Right? So people are asking that question, right? Is this about to be a World War III? Right? 01582 481 822 is the number in the studio. I want to hear some of your calls, hopefully in the next half an hour. 07779, right? 07779 481 822 for your social media, SMS, WhatsApp messages. Send me an SMS message, send me a WhatsApp message, and I'll try to get that to our panelists, right? Inshallah ta'ala. Alright, let's go straight into it. Alright, so the Iran-US attacks, right? So we covered that very, very briefly, brothers, of last week, right? So we've had the targeted assassination of General Qasim Soleimani, right? Arguably, as people were saying, the second most powerful man in Iran. Hashtag World War III is trending worldwide. People are asking this question. Iran also conducted its first direct military strike on the US, right? Since World War II, and did so without any response from US. And then, of course, we've seen the November 2011 Donald Trump video itself, right, where he's talking about, Obama attacking, Iran because he's got nothing better to do. He's failed that negotiation, and that's what he's going to do, and he's going to do it because of the, wanting to be re-elected. And fast forward 9 years on, it's actually Trump that's doing that, and it's not Obama or anyone else that he was accusing back then. It's a hilarious video. If you haven't seen it, you've got to watch that. All right, so that's where we are. My first question is, and we've also got, okay, great, we've got Professor Scott Lucas on the call too. Let me welcome you, Professor Scott Lucas. Thank you very much for joining us, and welcome to Friday Night Live.
Yes, hi, good evening.
Hi, good evening, great to have you tonight with us on Friday Night Live. I don't know if you caught the last couple of minutes introduction that I just gave.
I didn't, so I'll try to pick up.
Yeah, exactly. So the introduction was what you already know in terms of the existing tensions between Iran and the US, and then we've had the attack, of course, the assassination of the general, and then we've had a counter attack, and then we've had a bit of a war of words between the two nations. Tensions are no doubt at quite significant levels, right? We've seen the American ships all arrive into the Gulf. We've seen a number of commercial vessels in the UAE's territory being sabotaged. We've had a number of different comments. The first question to you, Professor Scott, is help our listeners understand what's driving this tension between the two.
Well, your listeners will probably know that ever since the Islamic Revolution in 1979, relations between at least the U.S. government and the Iranian government have been tense, to say the least. These are different systems. They both have interest in the Middle East and in the Persian Gulf. Yeah. And there's never really been a period where the two sides have sort of set aside their differences to sort of say, look, how can we get along, except possibly just after the nuclear agreement in 2015 under the Obama administration.
Right.
What's happened recently is you still have a supreme leader who heads up an Iranian system who's very anti-American, very suspicious of the Americans. You have a lot of internal tensions in Iran. You've had a lot of economic difficulties. It's a very changing population. Many people want to reform the system. And to be honest with you, they have been repressed, especially since the 2009 presidential election, which many considered to be fraudulent. But on the other side, you have a current administration, the Trump administration, which has not only ripped up the 2015 nuclear deal, which sort of gave us the space possibly to find a way to work with each other, but you have officials in that administration who frankly want regime change,
right.
Not to reform Iran. They want to get rid of the supreme leader and the religious leadership, and that has led not only to the withdrawal from the nuclear deal, but it's led to these comprehensive sanctions to try to break the Iranian economy.
Yeah.
And so as you mentioned, we had these skirmishes through the spring and the summer where there were attacks on shipping. There was a threat to tankers going through the Strait of Hormuz, through which 20% of the world's oil goes.
Yeah.
We got through that. At the last minute, Donald Trump pulled back from U.S. airstrikes inside Iran.
Yeah.
But, of course, what happened last week, which your listeners will know, is that the Americans effectively crossed a red line when they assassinated an official of another state.
Yeah.
And General Soleimani was not just, one of the most important military commanders in Iran. He was one of their most important political figures because he was the person who, whether he was propping up the Assad regime in Syria or whether he was trying to extend Iranian influence in Iraq or trying to negotiate or maneuver through the Yemeni civil war, he was, we would call him a wheeler dealer in the States. He was very, very good at it.
Yeah.
The Americans, specifically, not Donald Trump, interestingly enough, but the Secretary of State Mike Pompeo and the Vice President Mike Pence, decided last week they would take him out. Professor
Scott, what do you think led to that particular decision? What were the key? I mean, the tensions, as you say, have been there for a long time. I mean, interestingly enough, on the surface of it, many people would think the U.S. and the Iran, historical foes, as you're identifying, right? But they've had a lot of grounds of cooperation behind the closed doors, right? So, Iraq is a classical example. Syria is a classical example, right? Where there's been a lot of interest, for both sides, and they've actually cooperated in a lot of areas, right? And Iran's been a very helpful facilitator for ending a lot of those Sunni insurgencies in those geographies. So what's the real driver for then taking out this individual?
What happened is, and again your listeners may know this, but in recent months we've had protests in Iraq.
Yeah.
Now these have been protests against the government over discrimination, over corruption, over failure to deliver public services.
Yeah.
But the protests have also begun to become both challenging both America, we really don't want you here, and also challenging Iran. We don't want you dominating our government. And because of that, Iran and the U.S. sort of started to increase their friction with each other because they got a bit worried what was happening. And on December 27th, a pro-Iranian Iraqi militia, Kataib Hezbollah, killed. They fired on an Iraqi base. They killed an American contractor,
Yes.
and they wounded 4 American troops, as
Yeah.
well as Iraqi personnel.
Right.
And that became the
Right.
reason why the Americans then attacked these
Right.
militia bases. There
Right,
were 5 of them in Iraq and Syria.
Okay.
They killed 25 fighters, wounded more than 50. In response, supporters of Kataib Hezbollah charged the U.S. Embassy complex. They broke windows. They set fires.
Yes, yes, yes.
And that became the pretext for Pompeo and
Yes.
to go to Donald Trump and say, you don't want this to be like another Benghazi,
Yes.
which was where the American consulate in Libya was attacked in 2012,
Yeah.
and 4 Americans, including the ambassador, were killed. And that bumped Trump into approving the assassination.
Okay.
So it's the combination of a local case,
Fine.
this
Fine.
very special case of Iraq,
Yeah.
with this ongoing U.S.-Iran hostility, overlaid, quite frankly, with the current American officials who want regime change in Iran.
Right. Okay. Excellent. I just want you to hold on to that thought, Professor Scott, because I want to come back to you. But we've got Muhammad Atif, Washington-based journalist from the U.S. join us. Muhammad Atif, thank you very much for joining us once again on Friday Night Live. Right. I want to go straight to you with my opening question, and that is this Trump's kind of a gesture for his re-election ambitions?
It's hard to say. It was a foreign policy step that he had to take. I mean, there was.
I'm surprised you say it's hard to say, because he was ridiculing his predecessor and accusing his predecessor that he's going to be doing exactly the same thing not too long ago.
Well, you see, whenever there's election season, there are a lot of foreign policy issues that are in debate, and, all candidates have to say something about it. So I would not like to comment on that, whether this is going to help him in any way in 2020, although some media, across the globe and in the United States is saying that this might help him. But we're not discussing that. We're discussing the reason, right? This could be one of the reasons, according to some analysis. But the reason was consistent behavior of Iranian regime towards the neighboring countries and towards the United States. I mean, we have to look, see through a holistic approach. There were attacks. Iran is, fueling a civil war in a country which has a border with the Saudi Arab, and Saudis are fighting in Yemen.
Yes.
Iran is supporting militancy in the region, and most of it is Shia militancy.
But a lot of the times it's with the blessings of America, is it not, Muhammad Atif?
Well, I'm no one to say anything on that, because I don't think that's happening. Iran was very effective in fighting ISIS in Iraq. There is no doubt about it. And at some point, there are reports that the U.S. and Iran were cooperating in fighting ISIS.
Correct.
That's a fact. It cannot be denied.
Yeah.
But then again, there are other things. There were attacks on Saudi oil tankers. There was capturing of the UK ship.
Yes.
And then there are a lot of other things. The killing of U.S. contractors.
So you just think it's a natural conclusion of all of these, events that have been happening for the last, good few months, if not year plus.
So we can say that, probably the U.S. crossed that threshold.
Okay.
They had to give them a message.
Okay. All right, so that's interesting.
I look at it in that way.
Okay, fine. I want to come to Abu Israel in a minute, right? So I want you to, and Brother Zafar, to get your thoughts on this subject matter. I want to get not to say you guys are not experts, but I want to get the experts' thoughts first. I want to go back to Professor Scott Lucas, because I want to throw in something interesting, right? So I've been reading an article, I've got an extract from it for here, where it cites, first reason for tensions, world oil prices and oil markets. Now, you must have seen, well, at least those of us that are in the UK, I think you are too, in Birmingham, the price of petrol obviously has gone up, right? And so that was one of the reasons that this has been pointed out here. And the second reason is someone is giving is the signing of a new nuclear agreement with Iran that would guarantee a lion's share to American firms in the Iranian market. That's an interesting one. There's a third one too, but I'm going to come on to that later. Well, what are your thoughts on that, Professor Scott?
Well, I think, there's a lot of people who will try to reach for all these explanations, and we know that oil is important, and we know that Trump's election might be important, but I think you go back to what we know, and that is it wasn't Donald Trump who sanctioned or even drove the idea of assassinating General Soleimani. It was Secretary of State Pompeo, it was Vice President Pence, and they basically were working with the Pentagon to carry this out.
Yeah.
Trump, in fact, was trying to get face-to-face talks with the Iranians, sort of like a photo opportunity, as he's done with North Korea.
Yeah.
So that sort of knocks the re-election thesis out of the way. In terms of oil, now, the Americans at this point still take some of their oil from the Middle East, but there's no scheme for the Americans to take over oil in Iran or take over Iranian oil fields. There's not even really as much a scheme for the Americans to take over Iraqi oil fields. The big issue in Iraq is mainly competition or tension between the Iraqi central government and the Iraqi Kurdish regional government over the oil sales. I want to come back just to the general picture, which Mohammed said, and that is, I think there are two problems with what he says, which is, General Soleimani was a really, really bad guy, and he just had to be taken out, which is Mike Pompeo's excuse.
Yeah.
The first is just a general principle, and that is General Soleimani is responsible for the deaths of many, many people supporting the Assad regime in Syria, targeting Americans or using militias to target Americans in Iraq. But when you attack the official of a state and you assassinate him, you have crossed a red line that breaks all the rules. So the Iranians will say now, if they want to go after an American general, well, you did it to ours, why can't we do it to you?
Yeah.
If the Israelis want to take out an official of a state and assassinate them publicly, they'll say, well, the Americans did it.
Right.
So that's the first thing. That's a very serious red line which has been crossed. And secondly is really probably the idea that the Americans themselves have killed civilians, and you could make cases why American military have killed civilians in Yemen, have killed them in Afghanistan, have killed them in Iraq.
Yeah.
So should they be targets for what has happened?
Yeah.
And thirdly is just the practical question. It's easy to say, let's kill the bad guy. Let's take him out like a Hollywood movie. What's difficult is what happens next.
Right.
And what has been very clear is the Trump administration was not prepared for the Iranian response. For example, encouraging the Iraqi parliament to expel U.S. troops.
Yeah.
So if you are going to carry out an act like this, like killing General Soleimani, you need to be able to react and be effective rather than being confused and chaotic, as the Trump administration has been over the past week.
Fantastic. Professor Scott, thank you very much for that. That actually nicely brings me on to the next question, which was going to be around the U.S. policy in the region and also the Iranian aspirations within the region, right? But I want to, I've got two lovely gentlemen sitting in the studio and listening to the experts on the phone, and I want to bring in Abu Isra, and you've been listening for the last 15-20 minutes almost. Abu Isra, what are your thoughts on the tensions between Iran and US, and what's your reading?
Okay, my reading is, I want to put a context to this whole discussion, basically. The context is that this region of Middle East, in fact, the whole of these the Islamic lands, in 1924, we had an Ottoman Empire which was dismembered by the two colonial powers of the last century, Britain and France. And a century before that, we had an Indian subcontinent Muslim empire, which was again taken over by Britain as a colonial power. So the Muslims of this region and wider regions in India and the Middle East, they have seen in the last century that they have lost their two centers of powers, and the lands have been divided on a nation-state model. And so from two major centers, we have now around 55 plus small statelets, and these statelets they revolve around initially around those two colonial powers like Britain and France. But then after 1945, Americans obviously came in, and a lot of the regional states then start revolving around America. Now, in this context, what we need to understand is that Khomeini in the 1979 revolution, as Professor Scott mentioned, he came in, but BBC reported a few years ago that there were some discussions that took place between Mr. Khomeini and the Americans.
Correct.
As you correctly mentioned. Actually, if it was not American, in fact, it was the CIA.
Yeah, it was
to be a little bit more precise. Yeah. And so my reading is that although there has been many words, war of words in the last 40 years we've seen between the Iranian regime and the U.S. successive U.S. Governments, but the reality is that Iran has not ever taken any physical or material action or steps against the U.S. interest. In fact, Iran, if you look at the track record, Iran has been following the U.S. line when it comes to Afghanistan, Iraq, Syria. In fact, they have played a very positive role for the U.S. Foreign policy interests. Yeah. And in return, I think we can see that Americans have the successive regime, American administrations, they have kept this Iranian so-called Islamic regime in place. Yeah. So it's been a trade-off between the two powers, and I see this in this context basically.
Okay, that's interesting. Professor Scott, you've just been listening to those comments by our political analyst sitting here in the studio, Abu Isra. I mean, in terms of looking at the U.S. policy in the region, Professor Scott, right? I mean, it was coined very famously, that no nation has any, perpetual friends. It's just perpetual interests that these nations have, right? And I think that's what Abu Isra is alluding to. That you got the Americans, you got the British, and then their political capitalist states, and they're after their own interests. Now, U.S. policy in the region is, a lot of people are talking about destabilization and creating of all of these reactionary militancies, right? Which the Iranians have supported the U.S. For their profit for a very long time, and the US, for example, happily planted an Iranian-backed regime in Iraq, for example, right? Helped maintain the Syrian status quo, etc., etc. So, what's the bigger game in the region? Is it a case of now aligning the Sunni states of the region, of the Gulf region, plus Israel against Iran? Is that the bringing in Israel into the normalization element, and then Iran becomes the bogeyman of the region, or is it something else?
Well, I think the problem with saying that about the Middle East is there isn't just one issue across the Middle East. There are many issues across the Middle East. So, for example, you can see those issues align, as your studio guest was talking about, where sometimes it might be in your interest to quietly work with each other. So think about when the Islamic State took over one-third of Iraq and took over part of Syria. There was a window where, in effect, the Iranians and the Americans had a common interest in pushing ISIS back. Yeah. But generally what we have seen is, for two reasons, is that Iran and America will generally be pitted against each other. Now, one of those reasons has been really this touchstone of the idea of Israel and Palestine. Yeah. Because, of course, America's really been tied to Israel since probably the 1967 war. And, of course, Iran likes to portray itself, although sometimes I'm quite cynical they really are, but they portray themselves as they're the defenders of the Palestinians. Yeah. But the second issue, which I think is really, and this is where I have to would love to have a discussion with your studio guest, which means the interests don't really converge, and they are genuinely after each other, has been what we've seen since 2011 with the changes in all the countries across the Middle East. So, for example, when you talk about Syria and the rising in Syria, Iran's dedication to keeping the Assad regime in place. Yeah. It wasn't that the Americans necessarily wanted to get rid of Assad, but they didn't want to support the Iranians in that. And that's led to a very deadly combination in Syria where the civilians have paid the price for it. Yeah. If you talk about in Yemen, the Americans, of course, because of Saudi Arabia, have tended to support the Saudi intervention in Yemen. Yes. Whereas the Iranians tend to back the Houthi insurgency, and so the two tend to clash with each other, and guess who pays the price for that? Yeah. Yemeni civilians. Yeah. And in the same way in Iraq, Iraqi people want to be able to control their own fate. They want to be able to get a responsible government, which isn't just Shia versus Sunni, Shia versus Kurd, but represents the whole country. Yeah. But because Iran wants a government that serves its interest, and the Americans want a government that serves their interests, absolutely, guess who gets caught in the middle?
Yeah.
The Iraqi people.
Yeah. Okay. Okay, gents, we've got about three minutes left. Very, very quickly, concluding statements from all the gents, if we may. Professor Scott, whilst you are speaking, why don't you take a minute to just conclude? I mean, World War III, is that something that we genuinely need to fear, or is that just hype and we're going to see a de-escalation? I mean, I'm pretty much we've seen a bit of de-escalation, a bit of a quieter period now, but it's far too early, isn't it? At the moment, we don't know what's been discussed in the background, especially with this plane that's been brought down in Iran, also, and accusations and counter accusations around that. What are your thoughts, Professor Scott, in terms of how this is going to end?
No, I'm not going into the bunker myself.
Okay, okay, that's good.
I think when the Iranians carefully calibrated that attack for show against the Iraqi bases with U.S. personnel, making sure they didn't have any casualties, they were signaling they don't want a military confrontation. But the reason why I like to push that World War III question aside is, look, even if there's not World War III, we have got all these issues that continue that we've talked about where people are suffering.
Right.
And we need to stop making it a battle between the U.S. and Iran and trying to get all sides to act responsibly.
Thank you very much.
Start to deal with these questions.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Professor Scott, for joining us on Friday Night Live. Unfortunately, we've run out of time. I want to go straight to Muhammad Atif. Muhammad Atif, Sab, your concluding statements. Sorry for making you hold for a bit longer than I wanted to be honest with you. How is this going to end, Muhammad Atif, in your opinion?
I think we have to worry about the insurgencies more than World War III, because there is so much fighting going on in so many parts of the world.
Yeah.
If we really want to see peace, we have to address these smaller insurgencies and terrorist groups operating in different territories, in different circumstances. I think that's the bottom line where we need to focus and try to figure out how do we want to
Muhammad Asif,
end these insurgencies.
Thank you very much for your time, and thank you very much for joining us once again on Friday Night Live. Brother Abu Israel, you've got 30 seconds.
I just would like to quickly say that Muslims actually of the region, they want an independent policy, independent of the global powers, to be honest. These powers need to stop meddling into the affairs of other lands. I mean, the US is thousands of miles away. What are they doing in Iraq and in this region? Actually, this beggars belief that we're talking about insurgencies and all that. But I mean, there are powers, these international powers are coming into the region, causing all sorts of troubles. So Muslims need an independent way forward now. And we have enough of these wars and meddling into our affairs.
All right, thank you very much, Abu Israel, for joining us in the studio for the last hour. And Brother Zafar has been so patient, but you know what, I had to because you're our home guest.
No worries.
And presenter. Inshallah, I'm going to come back to you when we come back in the next hour, because I know you wanted to say 101 things.
No, that's fine, inshallah.
Yeah, is that okay, inshallah?
Experts there.
Jazakallah for your patience. And we're going to go into a commercial break, listeners. Inshallah ta'ala, we'll be back in a couple of minutes. Until then, assalamu alaikum.
You're listening to an Inspire FM podcast, making available our popular programs from our daily broadcast on Inspire FM.
Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Welcome back to Friday Night Live with me, Hafiz Sha'ban, on this Friday the 10th of January 2020 evening. Now it's turned 7 o'clock, and mashallah, we've just had a very interesting first hour where we've been discussing China-Pakistan economic border, the Belt and Road Initiative. Very, very interesting insights into some of the facts and figures around that initiative, and who are the main benefactors of that in particular economic program between China and Pakistan. It would be interesting to hear some of the indigenous Pakistanis and their thoughts on the actual benefits on the ground in Pakistan. 01582 481822 07779 481822. If you want to send in a SMS or a WhatsApp, you can do that, and you can say whatever you like. I'll only read out the bits that need to go on the air. And then the last half an hour, we were just discussing the tensions between Iran and US, right? So we had, mashallah, some fantastic experts. We had Professor Scott Lucas, we had Muhammad Atif from Washington. We were supposed to also speak to a brother in Dubai. Unfortunately, we couldn't get to him because the amount of guests that we had, and some interesting opinions on what's been happening between Iran and US. Are they on the same page? Are they aligned interests, or are they divergent interests, right? right? So that was interesting in terms of US policy in the region and Iranian aspirations within the region, right? Unfortunately, I wasn't able to go to Brother Zafar, and I wasn't able to get an opinion from Brother. In fact, before I go on to getting an opinion from Brother Zafar, let me also introduce our new guest that's joined us in the studio, mashallah. It's great to welcome the editor of 5 Pillars, mashallah, Brother Roshan Muhammad Saleh, right? So Muhammad Roshan is, of course, as I said, the editor of 5 Pillars. A lot of you will know 5 Pillars, mashallah. A journalist for the last 19 years, been there with Al Jazeera, been there with the, Press TV, and currently quite focused, I understand, on 5 Pillars. And mashallah, what a medium that is for bringing news to the Muslim community in the UK. So welcoming you first time in the studio, Brother Roshan. Welcome to Inspire FM and welcome to Friday Night Live.
Assalamu alaikum. Thank you very much for inviting me.
Yeah, you're welcome. Okay. All right. So let's start off very quickly because we're going to get the guest for the next story. Brother Zafar, you were so patient and I have to apologize to you.
I think most of the points I wanted to make were covered by, I think, some excellent guests we've had this evening, mashallah, very talented and I guess very sort of knowledgeable people. The only thing I wanted to add really was I think Iran did act responsibly in some ways. I think it had to show its public that it was going to retaliate to what was really a massive provocation. This was no ordinary thing. It was assassination of a senior general in Iran. But I think it signaled what it was going to do. And I think those signals were picked up by the Americans and evacuated. I don't know whether you saw some news clips, but there were news clips of helicopters, flying around, sort of ferrying people from some of the bases. And if you look at the damage itself, when you talk about missiles, you think missiles are capable of much more damage than knocking out a building or a side of a building, etc. So I think this was a calculated move to de-escalate the situation rather than to escalate it, but at the same time try and placate the nation. There were millions of people who turned up for the funeral. Yeah. So I think for that, I think in some ways, I think Iran needs to be commended for that. I think this could have got quite ugly for Iran and the Middle East as well, because what would have happened next? What would be the escalation cycle, etc. But having said that, I don't think, to be honest, I know there's lots of pressure on America to intervene, to attack Iran. I have a feeling, right, that there is a lot of cooperation that's happening in the background. Yeah. Iran used to be a key ally of America many years ago, and I suspect they'll still have contacts within the country. And I guess that the key glaring evidence for that is that in both the engagements, the 2 engagements that have taken place, in fact 3 engagements that have taken place in Iraq, in Syria, in Afghanistan, Iran has gained. So I think in some ways, I think, you could put that down to sort of Iranian strategy. But at the same time, I think there is a level of cooperation between America and Iran.
All right, thank you very much for that. And Brother Roshan, your thoughts on the tensions? Of course, 5 Pillars has been covering this story quite widely. A number of stories already are still featuring on the site. What did you make of the tensions, and what do you make of the next steps? Right, so we've had a bit of de-escalation with the retaliation. A bit of heads up of the retaliation, and then it's gone a bit quiet with the words of war words. But we've seen the passenger plane go down and the accusations against Iran at the moment also. So it's not completely entirely going away, and I'm sure there's a lot more happening behind the scenes. What's your thoughts on this?
Well, maybe I can tell you a little bit more about the Iranian point of view, because I know a lot of Iranians, and I've been speaking to them over the last week, and quite intensively actually. And there's 2 camps in Iran. One camp is that we're not ready for war. This is a superpower. We may be a regional power, but America's a superpower and can really do a lot of damage. And Iran has made quite a lot of gains in places like Iraq, Syria, Lebanon, Palestine over the last couple of decades, and it could see all those gains reversed. So that's the more pragmatic camp, which has probably won out. The more hardline camp is that they took out our top general. We have to respond in kind, and if we don't respond in kind, then we haven't established deterrence. So that is the worry of the more hardline camp, is that they haven't hit America hard enough. It clearly was a limited attack what they did. It was unprecedented. I don't think an American base has been hit by a state since World War II, and they didn't get a response. So that is an achievement, but ultimately they took out Iran's top general, a national symbol, a national hero in Iran. So it wasn't really a response in kind. Ultimately, I think this fight has been deferred to a later day. I don't actually agree that. I think Iran's and America's interests don't align fundamentally in the Middle East. So I think a bigger fight has been postponed to another day.
All right, fantastic. Good summary, chaps. So thank you very much for that. All right, we are going to move on to the next story. I'm just waiting for the guest to be lined up for the next story, and that is the way the Muslims are covered in the media. Right. So it's an interesting story, and some comments that were actually made by one of the regulators, of the press regulator rather, who said that the Muslims are treated differently by newspapers. It's great to have Sir Alan Moses himself, who was existing, or possibly has now stepped down as the chairman of the Independent Press Standards Organization. Sir Alan Moses, welcome to Friday Night Live on Inspire FM. Thank you very much for joining us this evening.
Not at all. Good evening.
Good evening. Fantastic. Thank you very much for joining us. So, I mean, a very interesting article, very interesting comments with regards to the way the Muslims are treated differently by press. Unfortunately, I observed that it's a bit late. You're about to leave your post. If not, you've already left.
I left it. I've already left. I left.
Right. So I was hoping you would have made that statement a lot earlier, whilst you were the regulator, and you could have enforced some of that regulation, over the body that you preside over. But of course, your successor is now coming in, and he's got that job to provide that guidelines. But first, let's talk about your observations, because those observations are something that the Muslim community has been calling out for a very long time, isn't it?
Yes, I'm very well aware that they feel very strongly that they're treated unfairly in the press.
Okay, so they're treated very unfairly in the press, but they really haven't had any recourse to actually get that readdressed, right, or get that looked at, and fairly addressed, and a recourse outlined.
Well, I think that the problem is that the expectation of what they would like compared with what the rules are very different. There are rules about accuracy and distortion.
Yeah.
And if those are breached, then IPSO, the Independent Press Standards Organization, will act. But one of the real problems that we come across is the feeling that they're picked out, that people of a certain religion or ethnic background are picked out for generalizations that are unfair. But then you have to ask the question, well, what sort of rule would you have? How would you draft a rule that would deal with this? And that's when it all becomes very difficult.
That's interesting. So, of course, I mean, just for our listeners, so we have Sir Alan Moses, who has now stepped down as the chairman of the Independent Press Standards Organization, right? So that's interesting in terms of those particular views. I mean, going forward now with your successor coming in, I do read that there's I don't know if it's already been published, but the voluntary guidance for journalists. I mean, again, emphasize the voluntary guidance for journalists when writing about the Muslims. So what's the latest update on that then, Salon?
Well, I mean, not being there now, I don't know what's happened last week. But I think there's going to be some further consultation this month, and my expectation and hope was that it would be published next month, so that would be February of this year, I hope.
Right, so your expectations for that to be published next month, and then of course, as you said, your reign has now been handed over. Is it to Mr. Edward Fawkes? Is it the new
Lord Edward Fawkes?
Yeah, Lord Edward Fawkes. So it's to be seen in terms of what then actually comes about with regards to that voluntary guidance, and how well that's actually then meted out into the media. I understand the challenge of providing guidelines to the media as opposed to then stipulating how you write about Muslims, but I do have in the studio the editor of Five Pillars, which is a Muslim media outlet, and a quite prominent one within the UK. I mean, Sir Alan Moses, writes about himself, and he says, "I speak for myself, but I have a suspicion that Muslims are from time to time written about in a way that newspapers would simply not write about Jews and Roman Catholics." And yet, what I'm hearing in terms of the words from Sir Alan Moses is that we can't quite do anything about it apart from provide some voluntary guidelines and hope for the best, I guess.
Well, we can do about it if it's inaccurate.
If it's inaccurate, factually inaccurate. But I mean, that's the problem here. We're in a bit of a grey area where they're writing about the Muslim community as they wouldn't write about the Jews and the Roman Catholics. It's not just the distorting of facts, because then it's a very binary discussion, isn't it? Yes or right or wrong.
Right. I mean, it's to do with...
it's those headlines that we see all the time, right?
It's the dangers of generalization, I think. The moment you group people together and attribute certain beliefs or characteristics, you run into very great danger, and I think that's something I'm very well aware of. I mean, the moment you have an atrocity committed by mad murderers, and in pretending to be in the name of Islam, it's terribly wounding and upsetting for someone who has that faith. I mean, frightened to go out during the day in case they're going to be shouted at or worse in the streets. And it's what you do about that is very it's difficult but important, I think.
Right. Okay.
So I guess there's a local example. So I don't know whether you heard or not, but there was a Luton-based terrorist who was captured before he actually went on to conduct, his act.
Yes.
And I think he's going to trial this week, or he went to trial last week. And there's been a small piece in the local media, the local free newspaper, hidden away in the pages in between. Whereas I think, had this person been a Muslim, had the targets not been Muslims, the expectation would have been that would have been that was a high
been Muslim
headline
atrocity all over the headline.
Yes.
Exactly. But what you're saying is that there's no guideline in IPSO to actually try to redress that sense of balance.
I'm hoping that's not right. I'm hoping that there will be, because the question, the unnecessary racial or religious identification is very dangerous. So that the journalists have to ask themselves how relevant it is to mention the religion that the murderer or the terrorist purports to invoke.
Yeah. So this is
may not be.
Yeah. So
I mean, this is the problem, that if you've got someone saying, "I am setting off a bomb in the name of the Roman Catholic Church," why is it relevant? Because everybody knows that it has actually nothing to do with that religion.
Absolutely. Okay, I want to bring in Brother Roshan and get your views on this particular story, Brother Roshan. Right, so you covered it on 5 pillars. We've got IPSO, right, is publishing a voluntary guidance for journalists, right, when writing about Muslims next month. Hopefully that's what Sir Alan's saying. Hopefully he expects that to be issued in next month. But that's the point. It's a voluntary guidance. I get the difficulty in actually making some stipulations, and it's not a question of factually being correct or incorrect, or maybe we can argue that factually.
Well, quite often it is.
Yeah. Okay. So maybe we can argue that it's a factual, but it's a bit of a conundrum. It's a bit of a difficult one, but there is a clear bias, and there's no doubt about it. I mean, this story that Brother Zafar is just pointing to is a clear demonstration of that. What's your perspective as someone from media? What do you think can be done?
There's 2 things to say. One is that as Muslims, we're sick and tired of the press in particular targeting us. That is how we feel, and I hope I appreciate Sarah Moses coming out with these comments. I think a lot of people wouldn't have. I wish it would have been addressed more when you were actually head of IPSO, but ultimately we feel under siege as a community.
Quite fair. I was saying these things, although I just didn't get as much publicity in the press.
Okay.
We
so
feel
you yourself were a victim of, I guess, the way the press operates.
Well, you raise a really problem. How You see, it's not just a question of stopping people saying things, it's also encouraging them. I mean, my Muslim friends would come and see me and say, why are there no positive stories about the good that these different communities do?
We need to go.
If I could just finish my point, that would be great.
How am I going to make
So, Alan, if we could, we could just let Brother Roshan finish his points first.
I'll be really quick.
Yeah, go on.
We feel under siege as a community. I think the Muslim Council of Britain did some analysis not so long ago, which found that the national newspapers in particular had an incredible amount of negative stories about Muslims. I think the Times, the Telegraph, the Mail, and the Express were really egregious kind of culprits when it came to that. And for Ipso to turn around and say, yes, it's a bad thing, but we can't do much about it, really isn't good enough. Because ultimately, if it was Jews being targeted, let's call a spade a spade. If it was Jews being targeted, the Jewish community would not stand for this. So why should the Muslim community stand for this, being targeted all the time? Ultimately, we are citizens of this country like everybody else. The second thing I want to say is Ipso itself fit for purpose? Ultimately, is it really independent? It is funded by the newspapers themselves, a lot of them which have clearly targeted Muslims. Is it an independent body? Is it fit for purpose? Why hasn't it issued a fine or sanctioned some of these newspapers heavily? That is a clear failure in my point, from my point of view.
I think those are very good points from Brother Roshan, Sir Alan Moses. I mean, what do you say with regards to, okay, fine, maybe there isn't a clear, a flagrant, violation of a regulation, okay, and these are purely guidelines, but when you're seeing that consistent pattern, there has to be some kind of an ethic, moral, principles of, that should be, applied and said, look, this is totally unfair.
Well, of course, to the extent that it's correct, it's unfair. But are we going to have a rule that says the press has to be fair? And if you do have such a rule, how are you going to enforce it? What rule are you going to apply that says to a newspaper you've got to be fair, that you've got to stop publishing negative stories? And if you ask that question, it seems to me there's no answer to it. Unless you want to license newspapers. If you license them and say you shall not publish unless you are fair, which is what you do with broadcasters, you could then enforce such rules. But we haven't tried to license newspapers since about 1640, I think was the last time. And I think we're against it. Are we going to send editors to prison for publishing an unlicensed newspaper? Of course we're not. What I'm saying to you is that you may be right, but what is nobody thinks about the remedy. Yeah.
Okay, I get the challenge. Brother Zafar, you want to say something?
Yes, I was just going to suggest maybe that if you asked, this is a newspaper owners in particular, I guess, if your guidelines included the fact that headlines had to be from the main story. The headlines had to be from the main story, i.e. they can't be made up, and the photographs which are attached to the stories had to be relevant to the story and current to the story. I think that will make a big difference, because a lot of the cases, if you read the details of the articles, they do convey some facts, but it's the headlines which I think distort and create a false image.
But I mean, Sir Alan, there's a very simple.
You're absolutely right about that.
Go on.
There is a rule that says that the headline has to be supported by what's in the article. And I mean, that was and there have been examples where Ipso has upheld complaints because the headline wasn't supported by the substance of the article.
I mean, what about actually, the use of the name of the religion itself? I mean, clearly, if you're talking about a rule, a rule that would, that we would be able to use and apply, then it's clear that Christianity is not used, Judaism is not used, but Islam and Muslims are used everywhere. I mean, that rule, I think, would pretty hold quite well.
Yes, but what if you have a terrorist falsely invoking the religion?
Okay, I mean,
not to publish that.
No,
I mean that's one of the problems that has happened. Isn't
have it in quotes in the article itself.
Sorry, Alan.
I mean, a lot of murderous madmen in recent history have been invoking totally unjustified, the particular religion. Are you saying to the newspaper you shouldn't publish that?
But I mean, the point here is it plausible or not? I mean, we have the right wing, murderers. We have the people who might do it in the name of other religions. But what we're saying is, of course, when it comes to Islam and Muslims, it's always the religion. But we've only got 2 or 3 minutes left, and I want to go back to Brother Roshan Muhammad Saleh's comment earlier with regards to the real independence of this body that is overseeing the press. I mean, and that's a very valid point because it's all funded by the papers themselves.
But who else was going to pay? Do you really want a press regulator paid for by the government? Goodness sake, Leveson recommended that the press, the people who are regulated, should pay for it, and that's what happens. But I can assure you that people like me and the people on my committees are entirely independent. Nobody told us what to say or what to think. Right. And the sources of the funds are agreed over a 5-year period. They have absolutely no hold over us as a result of the money.
Right.
So that I totally reject the allegation that we're not independent.
Okay.
I think there are real problems that you've importantly highlighted this evening, of which I'm daily conscious, because it is foul to feel that you're a victim of this general prejudice caused by generalizations. And I think that you constantly have to fight against it and to answer it. But I'm not sure that rules preventing people publishing is the answer. I think we want more publications. We want more of you to speak out. And I think it's really important what you do.
Right. Okay.
Both radio, television, and in the newspaper.
Yeah, great. Brother Roshan, all right, rules is not the answer, right? But we clearly see a dominant trend, right, which is about attacking Islam and the Muslims, right? So if rules is not the answer, what's the answer?
I honestly would like to see. I mean, the answer is to regulate the newspapers like TV is regulated. That's my answer because broadcast journalism doesn't target us in the same way. Could I ask, Sir Alan, before you go, did you feel when you were head of IPSO, did you feel as though some editors did have an anti-Muslim agenda?
No, I think that, I don't think they had that sort of agenda, but I think they were, from time to time, very careless. They didn't think about the impact and the context in which the articles were written and published.
Yeah, and I think the problem is
that... in a way, I mean, it's no defense.
Yeah.
But I don't think it was deliberate. I think it was inattention.
Right.
I think that's just as dangerous.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I'm going to say, inattention and just careless. I mean, isn't careless journalism and lazy, they call it lazy journalism, precisely one of the reasons why we have...
It's not an excuse. It's like saying the Iraq War was a mistake.
Yeah.
It's not a mistake. It's deliberate.
Sorry.
Yeah.
Okay. What was? Sorry.
So sorry. I mean, Roshan was saying that's not acceptable, and it's not good enough to say, it was just a mistake. I mean, lazy journalism or carelessness is just not.
I wasn't saying it as an excuse. I was saying it as an accusation.
Yeah. Okay. So Alan Moses, unfortunately, we're going to go into a commercial break. We're end of the half an hour allocated to the story. Thank you very much for your time this evening.
Very good wishes to you all.
Fantastic. Thank you very much for your time this evening and joining us on Inspire FM. Thank you very much. That was Sir Alan Moses.
Thank you for speaking to me.
Thank you. That was Sir Alan Moses, who was previously the head of the commission overseeing the press regulator, right? Overseeing newspapers and the other news agency bodies within the UK. Interesting comments, but as rightly pointed out by Roshan and myself, those comments are coming very late in the day when you're actually now transitioning into your next role, and then it is this point of voluntary versus.
It started a debate, to be honest, right? I mean, he didn't have to say anything even after retiring, but the fact that he has, I think it is. I think it may lead to some good. I think.
All right, we're going to go into commercial break. Let's come back and let's just digest that and get some thoughts in terms of what practically would be good to see. Listeners, we are going to go into a commercial break. We'll be back for the last half an hour. Do join us then. Until then, assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah.
Assalamu alaikum, this is Atif Nawaz and you're listening to an Inspire FM podcast.
Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Welcome back to Friday Night Live with me, Hafiz Sha'ban, on this Friday the 10th of January. Now turning to 19:30, so 7:30. We're now into the last half an hour of the show. Be good to hear some of your thoughts on the show this evening. 01582 481822 is the number here in the studio. If you want to speak to anyone in the studio, any of the panelists, to myself, on any of the stories that we've covered this evening, 01582 481822 is the number. For your SMS, WhatsApp messages 07779 07779 481822. We still have Brother Roshan from Five Pillars here in the studio, and we still got Brother Zafar, and I'm going to go straight to them, and I want to get Brother Roshan's views on that last story that we were covering. And you know what, as listeners, right, as members of this community, as members of this society, you all the time you're listening to the media, you're reading media, you're reading media stories, and you must be fed up, right? Muslims, Islam, and the distinction and the clarity between the way the Muslims are dealt with and treated in the media versus any of the other religions is just completely so obvious and blatant. I don't know why there can't be some, more than guidelines, but some laws to actually stipulate, equal coverage of faiths, right? And I'm sure we could, with all these intelligent minds, in these bodies, come up with some kind of guidelines, not guidelines, but some kind of rules, right? Just to say that guidelines are not enforceable, and then we can't really do much more than just go and have these conversations with these editors, and none of these editors have got, that was interesting, none of these editors have got an anti-Islamic agenda. I mean, that for me was quite an incredible comment. Yeah. But anyway, Brother Rush, your thoughts on that discussion?
Well, I think that, Sir Alan Moses says IPSO is independent. No one's telling him what to do. I'm sure no one is over him telling him, do this, do that. But reality, and this applies to any organisation, if you follow the money, you know who's making the decisions. Yeah. That is the reality in every single organisation in the whole world. And often the pressure doesn't have to be direct. It can be much more subtle. Yeah. Even if the very threat of funding being withdrawn is there, hanging out there in the ether, that is a subtle form of pressure. The fact is IPSO hasn't fined anybody, and it hasn't sanctioned anybody harshly either. That in itself is extremely telling. It's been in existence for, I think, over 4 years now, and it really hasn't taken any harsh action against any of the newspapers it regulates.
For the last 4 years?
Yeah, at least, yeah. Wow. I think that ultimately what we have in broadcast journalism, for example, Ofcom regulates it, and there are strict guidelines that broadcast journalists must follow when it comes to impartiality and discrimination, etc., etc. And those guidelines are enforced, and offenders are fined and sanctioned and perhaps even taken off air. Right. Now, that kind of regulation, and that's why we feel less targeted by the BBC or ITV than we do by the Times and the Telegraph.
That's interesting.
The press is not regulated like that at all. It's a self-regulation process which goes on, and self-regulation ultimately means no regulation. And for my understanding, IPSO really is just a front organisation, really, which is there to give the impression that the press is being regulated. But all it is really is a mouthpiece for the press itself. So what we need is the newspapers in this country. I mean, they just won Boris Johnson an election. They are overwhelmingly right-wing, Tory, pro-war, pro-capitalist, and there are some exceptions, of course. But they don't have that regulation in place to, kind of curb those excesses, and that's what we desperately need. And Muslims, we shouldn't be begging for this. I mean, the reason why that regulation doesn't exist is because we're not strong enough lobby, ultimately, and we don't have the levers of power that can be pulled to enable that to happen. But as I said, we're not guests in this country. We're citizens. We have rights. So we must be demanding this, because there wouldn't even be a question about accuracy or what can we do. We want to do something, but we can't do it. That conversation would not take place if it was the Jewish community under attack.
Even that conversation. I just found out. It's what can we do? That.
Part of the reason it wouldn't happen to the Jewish community is because the Jewish community would act. Right? If there's something inaccurate or something inflammatory written by them, they would act, right, whether it's legal ways or whether ways. And the thing is that the community is very docile. Muslim community is very docile. They expect things to happen, right, but don't take the steps in making them happen.
Can I just say that there's two actually quite encouraging developments over the last year. First of all, the Muslim Council of Britain has got this media monitoring unit headed by, I think, Miqdad Versi, the Assistant Secretary General, and he's basically forensically going after all the mistakes targeting of Muslims in the national newspapers, getting corrections, etc., etc. So that's one thing. It's not enough, but it's a good thing.
Part of MTV,
the second thing is that there are lawyers out there. There is Rahman Law Solicitors in East London, which have literally gone after the Times and the Telegraph in particular, and won many, many victories. I'm talking about legal victories in the High Court, with newspapers having to apologise, print apologies, and also pay compensation to victims. So there's that double route which is happening.
All right, good stuff, chaps. Unfortunately, great conversation, but we got to move on to our next story, right? And you're going to be pleasantly surprised. We've got a positive story to cover. So it's always good, right, that we've got a positive story to cover. And we've got brother Kamran Hussain from Birmingham, who's going to be joining us to give us a bit more about this. But let me tell you, brothers here in the studio, what the story is. Birmingham Muslims have been given shelter to homeless throughout winter. All right, so mashallah, some good initiatives there in Birmingham. Rough sleepers will be able to bunk down safely in a central location for as long as the cold snap lasts, right? Which generally is at least a few months, I think. Brother Kamran Hussain, Assalamu alaikum and Jazakallah khair for joining us on Friday Night Live on Inspire FM. Welcome. How are you?
Wa alaikum assalam. Wa alaikum assalam wa rahmatullah.
All right.
Thanks for inviting me.
Okay, Jazakallah khair. Okay, tell us more about this initiative. What's driven this local initiative by the Muslim community in Birmingham?
Well, I mean, there's quite a lot of homeless in Birmingham, and we've had quite a problem here for a number of years now. It's on the increase. We've had a number of deaths in Birmingham. A lot of organisations, Muslim organisations included, have done quite a lot in terms of projects. And this year, some of those projects can be quite difficult. For example, last year, I mean, I'm the chief exec at Green Lane Masjid. I don't know if you've heard of it, but we're based in Small Heath in Birmingham.
Okay.
And last year we ran a similar project where we opened our doors to the homeless for 4 weeks. So every night we were feeding them, housing them.
Yeah.
And that was quite a difficult project to keep it open for that number of weeks. It required financial resources, connecting up with all the restaurants to arrange food for the homeless. We had about on average about 15 people a night, 25 on our coldest nights when it was below zero, and it requires a number of volunteers as well. And it's certainly not easy because you get an eclectic mix of people. They have a number of problems, some of them psychological, others drugs, alcohol, etc.
Right.
It's not easy managing those people, and you do need a fair number of volunteers to do it. So by the end of that month, alhamdulillah, we managed to house about 10 people.
Okay.
Mashallah, one person, was coming there every night. He was reading the Quran. He even became a Muslim, mashallah.
Mashallah, wow.
And I'll tell you an interesting story, actually. There was one chap who came in one night, and, we had one of our scout leaders who was volunteering that night. He knows first aid, and we saw that he had a wound on his hand. So he said, look, this could be quite serious. And thankfully that night, some nurses had heard about us on the ITV local news.
Right.
So they popped in to give some support, and they, saw his hand and said, look, if you don't get into a hospital, Qadar there's a likelihood he could die tonight because it looks septic. So he didn't want to go to the hospital because, he was a drug user, and once he gets into hospital, he won't have access to his drugs or his drug pusher. So we had to coax him into an ambulance, get him over to hospital, and as soon as he got there, they had to operate on him, and the doctor said the same thing. Look, Qadar if you hadn't allowed you to bring him over tonight, it would have been very likely that he would have died. Right? And through that process, mashallah, he managed to wean himself off drugs at the time. We managed to get him back in contact with his family, which he hadn't spoken to or seen for quite a while. And we seem to get him back on track. So that's some of the benefits, coming out from the work, this sort of work. And, this year what we've done is we realised how difficult it was last year, but we definitely wanted to do it again. So what we did was, we partnered up with a number of other organisations. We've got a Safat in Birmingham. We've got, Muslim Aid. We've got, a number of Masajid, Masjid al-Falah, Great Bar Muslim Association. And we said, let's pool our resources together, finances, volunteers, right? And, rather than one of us, taking the heavy load, we can all share it amongst ourselves and make it a lot easier.
Yeah.
So that's what we've done.
Okay.
I've got a unit in Lionel Street in Birmingham. We've opened the doors. It's been open since Monday. We've allocated days to each masjid. We're feeding them. We're housing them. Alhamdulillah, and it's a lot easier.
And how many people are coming through those doors seeking the support and the shelter, Brother Kamran?
So at the moment we're getting about 12 to 14.
Right.
Now we might squeeze some more in. We had to turn a few away over the last days. So we're looking at how we can, practically get as many people as we can into the unit.
Yeah.
Initially we opened up just for men, but we realised, there are, a couple of women turning up as well.
Yeah.
It's difficult to turn them away, so we created a secluded area and section for them with a separate toilet and got a portaloo. And delivered as well. So
fantastic. And you mentioned already the local ITV news. So you've had some good positive media coverage on the initiative, Muslim community. Adding some positive.
We've been on ITV News. We've been on BBC News. We've been on the BBC were there yesterday recording. We've been on Birmingham Mail.
Right.
And the difference is that we alhamdulillah, Greenland Masjid is quite well known. We probably have about 100 articles written about us, from the Metro to the Telegraph to the Times, the Guardian, etc., from all the work we do.
Right.
And we probably have about 15 television appearances and about just as many radio appearances a year. Now, a lot of the stories we do, for example, celebrate Eid, which is the biggest, Eid event in Europe, outdoor event. We run. We get 80,000 people. It's one of the most tweeted stories on the BBC.
Wow.
Now, when you look at the comments to those stories, they're still quite negative. Right? People saying, well, why do Muslims need to run this event? And it creates a lot of congestion. Some of the standard stories that we get out there don't actually create positive PR.
Yes.
And not that we do it for the PR.
Yes.
Right? What we're doing, the reason we're doing it is to show the true face of Islam.
Yeah.
Yeah?
Yeah.
So, because people have got a certain view of Islam,
yes.
we need to present the proper view of Islam.
Yeah.
Right? So that's why, we're doing it to please Allah, and we're doing it to show
for the da'wah,
what true Islam is.
Yeah. So you'll be glad to hear that we've got the editor of Five Pillars sitting here in the studio too, mashallah, right? It's right opposite me, right? So Brother Roshan. So Brother Roshan, of course, I mean, as Brother Kamran saying, these positive stories, right, don't necessarily get that kind of level of media coverage. We're not surprised by that at all. But of course, we got to try to push them as far and wide as we can into the mainstream media. But then, of course, we've got the Muslim outlets that definitely do cover those positive, stories to make sure that there's a presence there, there's a story there, and we're trying to get that word out as far and wide as possible, right? So it's good to see that, for example, Five Pillars, regular covers those kind of stories. I mean, how important is it, and to what extent is the community, are you finding nationally, being able to do that, to try to project those kind of good initiatives out there in the mainstream media?
I mean, the community is doing it absolutely all the time, but the media isn't generally covering it. I mean, even ourselves, I was going to ask you for Brother Kamran's number so that we can go up and do that story, because we haven't covered that story in particular. Maybe it's a question of resources and staff, etc. Muslim media generally is kind of under-resourced and understaffed, so we struggle to cover everything, and the mainstream isn't that interested. But yeah, it's these kind of initiatives on the ground that really kind of, I mean, all I can say is whenever we do a positive story on Five Pillars, it gets more traction than the negative stories. Yeah, it does actually.
That's interesting, right?
But generally, as journalists, we tend to consider news to be the negative stories.
Correct. Yeah.
These are the hot stories, and that's why we cover those stories. And generally, that is true. Those are the stories that will get the most traction. But on Five Pillars, Muslims, we're so starved of positive stories, aren't we? That we just latch onto it And yeah, so inshallah, long may that continue. Yeah.
All right, good, Brother Kamran. Jazakallah khair. And as Brother Roshan said, we'll be providing your details to Brother Roshan so that you can get 5 pillars to cover your good old story. How long does this continue? Is it all throughout the month of January, is it?
No, we've extended it to the end of February now.
Ah, mashallah, man. Wow, that's a very long project. Inshallah, may Allah make it easy for you, brothers, and reward you immensely. Fantastic initiatives out there. Keep up the good work, inshallah.
Jazakallah khair.
All right, Jazakallah khair. Okay, listeners, that was Brother Kamran Hussain from Birmingham giving us an update in terms of the initiative that's going on in Birmingham. Brilliant initiative. I'm sure they've got something very similar happening here, Brother Zafar, in Luton, but not quite the shelter. But you know, what is it? The winter kitchen or something, isn't it?
There is the Luton the soup kitchen.
Soup kitchen, that's it.
Soup kitchen that serves, I think, regularly. I think every Friday, as far as I know.
Yeah.
That there are schemes where basically, I think Medina Masjid has been involved in this, where they give out winter sort of kits for people, you know, the homeless people.
Winter kits. Okay. Hygiene and what?
Well, it's warmth kits basically.
Warm
so
kit,
you have sleeping bags, tent maybe, something to keep sort of dry.
Yeah.
Those type of things. And I think there's always lots of initiative. Inspire Family involved in lots of initiative. We had an initiative last week where we're in town giving away free food basically.
We're going to come on to that in a minute.
Those type of things. So there's a lot happening. And I think, to be honest, on the comment of publicity, you know, we need publicity, but more than that, we need support from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, so that we're doing it for the right reason. And the reason that we're doing it is to please Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And if that happens, then Allah will make, you know, that known. If our purpose is to do it so that we get a few headlines, then we may get a few headlines, right? But the barakah isn't going to be in it. So I think the proper way to do it is that we're doing it for Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and then because we want to please Him.
Yep, no doubt about that. But I mean, the publicity is not for the individual; is for the work that Muslims in general are doing, and that's to counter a very negative portrayal of Muslims, and that's very important. That is da'wah, right?
Well, the thing is, you'll get that. The thing is, it's a double-edged sword, right? Because you'll get the publicity if you're doing it genuinely.
Yeah.
If you're doing it for the headlines, you won't get it because they'll realise you're doing it for the headlines.
It's a shame, though, that we have to prove our humanity.
It is true.
Exactly.
It's like we have to prove we are good people, we're nice people.
Exactly. It's true. But
it's not a level playing field, is it?
It's not a level playing field, but we know the challenge that's out there, right? And we know we're up against it. So we're against the way. We have to do that. That's the point, right? So we have to prove it. We have to prove that look, we're involved in the positive ones. We have to do those initiatives, and we have to try to get that publicity.
The thing is, we have to, but we have to do it because our deen is telling us to do it.
Correct. I mean, that's what motivates us.
We have to be true to our nature.
Yeah.
If we're true to our nature,
I'm not talking about organising. Let's clean Luton and just go there, take a picture, and go back home. Yeah, and genuinely all the litter's still on the streets.
That might happen. You don't know. So.
I've heard of those initiatives. But anyway, chaps, we're going to move on. We've about got 6 minutes left of the show. MashaAllah. I tell you what picked up. Every week, the team at the Friday Night Live, they expect us producers to look at the stories and what's caught our attention, what's going to make a good story. And I saw this headline. I was talking to you earlier, Brother Roshan, about it, which is Muslim population of England passes 3 million for the first time. And I thought, well, I'm not sure. Maybe I missed it, but the mainstream media not cover that, man. That must have been
the Daily Mail did. Not for good reasons.
Yeah, exactly. They must have been alarmed and petrified.
Yeah, Tommy Robinson's going to be very upset in his jail cell or wherever he is.
Yeah, right, exactly. All right. So what was the media? How are they picking that story up? So for the listeners who are not aware of it, I mean, this was on 5 pillars. Muslim population of England passes 3 million for the first time. A lot of the times, people ask, or you probably have discussed, there's 2 million of us in the UK, and then the figure was there's 2.5 million of us in the UK. Now it's 3 million. Wow.
I've got some bad news for people who are because the general population of the broader, I guess, the people is on the decline, right? And the only one of the I guess the communities which is still focusing on the family and still the family is pretty much intact, is the Muslim community. And if you have a family which is intact, right, then you're likely to have family and offsprings, etc., and that they're likely to increase, and the others are likely to decrease. So therefore,
I mean, I think there's three reasons for the increase in the population. One is, Muslims are having more babies. It's something like 3 per family, whereas non-Muslims it's like 1 per family, something like that. So there's that reason. Also, conversion is not a massive factor, but the conversion is a factor as well. But also immigration as well. Obviously, we have an aging population in this country, so we need young people to come and pay the taxes and do the jobs, and a lot of them are Muslims.
I guess who's going to be doing that exactly?
So whereas the non-Muslim community is an aging community, whereas the Muslim community is still quite a young community. So, but at the same time, Tommy Robinson, don't be scared. We're still a small minority in this country. We're still a weak community. We, in terms of numbers and otherwise, we don't have the power, and ultimately it'll be.
But bad news is right. You've only got a limited period left before.
Well, it'll be 100 years before
get to power structures and stuff. So.
All right, good. All right, chaps, that was a good story. But then of course that also brings its challenges for the Muslim community itself, opportunities and challenges, right?
I don't think we should focus just on numbers. It's not all about numbers and there's 3 million of us. But does that mean there's 3 million practicing Muslims? 3 million Muslims are going to bring barakah to their families and the community around them? I'm not so sure.
Yeah, exactly. I think that's that's the more pertinent point, isn't it? Yeah. Mashallah. I mean, we've never had a problem with the numbers. It's actually then producing the quality.
Quality,
as opposed to the numbers, and I think that's what the focus needs to be, right? And then actually also, taking advantage of that, opportunity, because this is a blessing in all of the Muslim lands. When they look at the statistics and they look at the populations in the Gulf, in Africa, in any of the Muslim countries. It is the fact that the majority of the population is young, right? And with the youth is the opportunity, right?
But then again, I think you have to sort of bring in other factors into how society develops, right? And I think if you generally look as the society becomes affluent, the focus on children having bigger families, etc. The focus disappears. They tend to have smaller families, right? Because they want more of a quality life rather than sort of making sure that they're secure and safe and secure. So generally, the population trend decreases as the prosperity of the society increases. So
right.
I think that
is that some private research you've been doing, Brother Zaf?
It's a known fact, my friend.
All right, we've got 2 minutes. Very quickly, let's cover this last story. Luton families enjoy holiday fun fair thanks to Be a Good Neighbour campaign, which has of course been run by Inspire FM last week, right? So unfortunately, I wasn't around. Tell me what happened.
Yeah, so basically, the Fun Fair organisation, I think it's called D&G, we worked with them during Inspire Eid. And they basically reached out to us and said, look, we're in town during Christmas period. Why don't you come down and help? Why don't you do something here? Yeah. What we'll do is we'll give you 100 free tickets and we'll reduce it to £1 a ride. Why don't you do something in town? And we thought, instead of just calling out to people, why don't we make use of it? So we thought, well, why don't we have some stalls up there and start giving out free food to people, right? Because they're going to be in town shopping, etc., etc. And then we galvanised the community. Lots of businesses donated lots of food. There was a soup kitchen where we were giving out soup, basically. And we're giving out sort of hot cups of tea to people.
Wow.
So in effect, it became more of a kind of like a community thing.
Fair, almost like a fair, right?
Community fair with free food. I mean, normally.
And this was part of the Be a Good Neighbour campaign, right? So I mean,
I think I'm too impressed by the title of it, because I think it implies that we're not good neighbours as it is, and we are. But I think the message is clear that we need to focus on really trying to create. An Islamic attitude, right, to our neighbourhoods, which is that we're responsible for the 40 sort of neighbours on our right and 40 to the left, and to get that message across, really. That's the key thing as well.
Okay, all right, gents. Unfortunately, we're fast running out of time. We're just about to see the red screen come up, which means it's the last 60 seconds of the show. Brother Roshan, I want to reach out to you. Thank you very much for coming into the studio. It's been fantastic having you here, inshallah. And next time when you're around, it'll be great to see you here once again. Just reach out, inshallah ta'ala. And if you have some time, I know you're a very busy man. Then it'll be good to get you in the studio. And also, likewise, Deputy Editor, Mr. Dilly Saab, it'll be good to hear from him inshallah sometime soon. Jazakallah khair for joining us. And Brother Zafar, as always, Jazakallah khair for joining us in the studio. Listeners, we are coming towards the end of the show. Interesting show, inshallah ta'ala. It will be up on our podcast link, Friday night link, very shortly after the show this evening, inshallah. We'll be back next week with a new show. If you want to input into some of the stories that we cover for next week, feel free to reach out to us on 07779481822. You can send us your thoughts, suggestions, and we're more than happy to look into any particular story that you may feel that we want covering, inshallah ta'ala. Otherwise, do contribute and share share your thoughts and your sentiments and your feelings on some of these stories. No point holding those sentiments back and those feelings back, right? You have to air them and discuss it with someone. Otherwise, you're going to become a very frustrated individual. Okay, until next week, assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.
Thank you for listening to our podcast. We stream our daily broadcast on inspirefm.org. You'll find all our daily updates on our social media at Inspire FM Luton.